I'm going to ask Dr. Tan to comment on that, and other people can weigh in on this. You know, when is this appropriate? How, just thoughts about it.
So I think, there are various aspects to this question. The problem when parents and physicians start using FDA-approved drugs for non-approved use in rare disorders is that we will never be able to answer the fundamental question of whether this drug is truly effective for this disorder. One of the things I tell all parents is that all drugs have side effects. There's no single drug that has no side effect. The drug that has no side effect is essentially homeopathic. So if you're looking at giving your child a specific drug, whatever that drug may be, you need to realize there's always side effect. So the question is not, is there side effect? The question is whether the benefits outweigh the potential risks. And the only way we can really determine whether a drug is effective is to put it through a properly conducted clinical trial. And I was going to touch on this later, but since we are on this topic now, I will just give you my perspective on it. I think parents have often asked us, why do we need to use a placebo? Why do we need to go through this randomization placebo-controlled trial? Why can't we just give all these drug X to all these children and see whether it works? Now the problem is that if you do not have a control group, if you do not have a placebo group, and you see some changes, be it positive or negative, you have no idea whether that is actually due to the drug or whether that is just due by chance. And that's the problem that I think a lot of us face all the time. There are a lot of drugs out there, as Dr. Williams has said. There are physicians who can just prescribe it. But it really doesn't help the community. It doesn't move the science forward. We would not be any wiser a year, 10 years, 20 years from now if we did not conduct properly, do not have rigorous clinical trial that are well conducted with rigorous methodology and with measurable outcomes. And I think that's the problem with fast tracking of a drug, that yes, you can put it through the process, but are you going to be able to answer the fundamental question? I would argue that a clinical trial that does not or cannot answer the question that is set out to answer is unethical. And a clinical trial that, if the compound is found to be effective, cannot be used by the FDA for its new drug application process is unethical, because then you have put children through a clinical trial, exposing them to harm, and not be able to achieve your ultimate outcome, which is to put that compound on the market.
Okay. Dr. Roth-Klein.
I can't comment on off-label use, because the FDA really doesn't sort of regulate at all the practice of medicine. I can point out, though, there's for people who are interested in sort of the mishaps of things that were assumed in the absence of research to be safe and effective. There are a lot of case examples. They're out there. They're published, particularly in pediatrics and neonatology, where we assumed for a whole lot of years that children were just little adults. We thought we shouldn't enroll children in research because we didn't want to expose them to the risks of research. And therefore, every time a physician gave a drug to a child, they were essentially enrolling them in their own experiment, except nobody, it wasn't controlled, nobody was doing the follow-up on the results. And we realized how much harm we were doing to children by not being able to collect that data. And since there's been legislation, in the past 10, 15 years in this country that has really sort of spurred a lot of pediatric clinical trials of drugs that are FDA regulated, our office has actually gone back and published some findings of, gee, let's see what happens if we just take drugs at the doses that we think are effective in adults, and sort of do some nice calculations based on these formulas, and put them into children, versus actually do the testing in children and compare the doses at the end. So what do you get in the formula versus what do you get if you actually test the doses in children? And lo and behold, what we find out is that about a third of the time, if we don't actually test the dosing in children, and particularly as children get younger, the dose is wrong. Based on these nice, formulas that everybody has in their pharmacokinetic textbooks in clinical pharmacology, which were a useful place to start, but are not the end-all and be-all. And then we also looked at the adverse event profile of the drug in adults, so the side effect profile, and then compared that to the side effect profile of the drugs when we tested it in children, and found again, probably another third of the time, there were side effects in children that could have never been predicted based on the side effects in adults. And so that's part of the reason I think that we take our obligation to protect children through research as opposed to from research so seriously, because otherwise there's the potential to do a whole lot of harm.
Can I interject one more perspective on this? I posed this question to my husband, who works for a large pharmaceutical company, and I was surprised by his response. And he said, there's only cons to fast tracking, which surprised me. And his reason for that was that the preclinical trials and the early trials are less expensive to do than the later trials, and that we shouldn't make decisions on money. That's the job of large pharmaceutical companies to do. But at the same time, when we're spending the money of foundations and organizations that are graciously funding our research, we have to be ethical in our use and in the best use of the money that we're given to do the work as well. And so.
Okay.
But just, the plot, but I'll beg to differ with your husband who's not here. I'll have a word with him later. But the plus or the upside, I hate to say this, but it's common sense again, which is one of access. So it's for the rest of us, that live in places that may not have access to expert clinical trial centers with these ultra-promising drugs that are in phase 2 and 3 and what have you. Our access to better medicines is by going to the drugstore, to our CVS or Harris Teeter or Hannaford's or what have you, and trying to get that pharmacist to pro-offer, in response to a prescription, this promising medicine. And so that, the prospect of what we've been using this term fast tracking, which really is a non-term actually, but expedited clinical development process is such that wherever we live, our children or ourselves, our loved ones would have quicker access to better medicines than what's currently available. So that's the upside. The downside for your husband is what you described. But, let's not lose sight of the fact that one of the reasons that we're here right now is we're trying to play our role in delivering better therapeutics, better medicines for people with Angelman syndrome.
If I could go, I'm not sure if I'm going forward or back, but if I could go back to the off-label question, I think the thing that parents need to recognize and the physicians that they're working with need to recognize is that when you're doing an off-label use, in the context of our discussion here, I think what you need to recognize is that you're basically starting a clinical trial with one participant. And frankly, it is going to happen. And I think I remember when I spoke, I think it was at an ASF conference in '99, when at that point there was a lot of discussion. It came, that time it was there were a lot of things being suggested from the autism community about things that should be tried, and this was spilling over to the Angelman syndrome community. And, and I walked in that talk, I walked the group through the kinds of questions that they should ask if they're considering doing this. That you really do need to decide what are your, it's exactly like you're doing a clinical trial with one person. You have to define what your objectives are, what are you going to be measuring, how are you going to know if you're, trying this exploratory treatment with your son or daughter or loved one, how are you going to assess whether it has worked or not? I'm not going to come out and say don't do it, because I know there are parents that are desperate that want to try anything. But if you are going to do it, work with your physicians, do it in a measured, controlled way, and really think through what you're going to measure, what you're going to assess. How are you going to determine whether this helped or hurt your child? So.
I know as a physician myself, I began to feel very inadequate about how to adequately inform a family that I'm going to use a drug for an off-label purpose. And as I get older and get more experienced in medicine, I realized how really difficult that is. And Winhan's comments are taken as well with merit about am I being responsible or ethical to the family for that. But I mean, we know that off-label use is prevalent throughout medicine in many, many arenas. I think my sense is that in the rare diseases, the off-label use gets extended to ideas and hypotheses that are much more dramatic than in the usual flow of clinical medicine. So caution is warranted.
The other thing I would like to emphasize is that one of the biggest differences between enrolling your child in a properly conducted clinical trial versus using a drug prescribed by your own physician off-label is the degree and extent of monitoring, safety monitoring, that your child would receive through the clinical trial. So when we do clinical trials, we are obligated, as part of our study design, to keep in touch very closely with the participants, with the parents. We do questionnaires at very regular intervals, at times weekly, and then at times every few months. And we have blood tests, urine tests, and other investigations as needed to make sure that no harm comes out of using the drug in the child. Now, if you were to go to your own physician and have a drug X prescribed, sure, your physician could prescribe that, but I would bet my bottom dollar that your physician is not going to spend 10 minutes or 20 minutes every week calling you to find out, going through a structured questionnaire to find out whether your child has those side effects.
Right, and physicians just are busy with lots of things to
Exactly.
do, and so the point's well taken.
Right.
All right, very good.
Although
Why
the
don't-
caveat is, I mean, they may have gotten the placebo, so you're spending a week, week by week assessing how the placebo's going. So, I mean, again, let's keep the equipoise in play here. Unless this is an open label trial that you're talking about, in which case it violates potentially your informative role about the experiment. But just remember, sometimes the reason you do that is, again, you're trying to compare apples to oranges with regard to your test treatment against placebo in the instance you used and what have you. It's a little
Okay.
different from routine patient care.
Okay.